Okay, welcome everyone back to this Broad MIT colloquium that we're holding here, which is jointly organized by the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Center at the Broad Institute and then AI+D with an EECS at MIT. And I'm very, very excited to have Mengdi Wang here from Princeton today. As you know, in this colloquium series, we feature speakers who, not only bring machine learning methods and techniques into biology to answer important questions there, but in particular also go the other way around of having, important biological questions then motivate foundational developments in machine learning. And I know we'll hear a lot of that today in the topic of reinforcement learning and sequential decision making. So Mengdi is an associate professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the Center for Statistics and Machine Learning at Princeton. And she actually got her PhD here at MIT, here at MIT in EECS in Leeds. In 2013 and then joined Princeton after that as a faculty. And she got a lot of different prizes for her research, including the NSF Career Award, the Google Faculty Award, MIT Tech Review 35 Under 35 Innovation Award, et cetera, et cetera. So Mengdi's research really focuses, as I said, on data-driven decision-making, sequential decision-making, and reinforcement learning, and in particular on algorithmic and statistical foundations of these types of questions. And not just the foundations, but then also actually bringing that into important applications, in particular also including biomedical applications. And so I'm super excited to have Mengdi here, and hopefully this will also lead to many more collaborations, et cetera, between her group and also the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Center. So the floor is all yours, Mengdi. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. So I'm super excited to be here in Kendall Square, because this has always been my intellectual home. I did my PhD right there in data center, and I come here for lunch a lot. So it's so nice. It feels really like being back home here. Okay, so I'm an associate professor in Princeton University, and I did my training at MIT. So we want to study the foundation of artificial intelligence. Especially today, I want to talk about a particular focus of my research on generative AI models. I will talk about diffusion models in particular. Okay. Also, I will tell you a little bit about some new AI initiative happening in Princeton in case anyone want to be interested in Princeton in the future. Okay, so here we are. So the word generative AI, it has been like the trendy hot words nowadays. Okay, so if we look back into the brief history of generative AI, okay, the history is really short. We only got almost like 10 to 12 years. Okay, so the initial idea of generative AI started from variational encoders. Okay, and starting from them, there are just, I would say, a variety of deep learning models, maybe transformers, there are text-based models, BERT to ChatGPT, and there were also vision models. And the vision models we're the most familiar with are, for example, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 3, and more recently, Sora by OpenAI. Okay, so there are different forms of generative AI models. And in my own research, we want to understand the statistical foundation of learning such generative AI models, and especially using generative AI models for optimization, for generating novel designs, and for sequential optimization. And reinforcement learning is usually one of the key technology for fine-tuning generative AI models. And generative AI models can be used for making better RL, to make reinforcement learning better. Okay, but our focus today is going to be on diffusion models. Okay, and the very beginning was variational autoencoder. So the goal of VAE was not about generation. The goal of VAE is try to compress high-dimensional data into lower-dimensional representations for data compression. Okay, and VAE works by having an encoder mapping data from high dimensions to lower dimensions, and another decoder mapping lower dimensional representations to reconstruct the high-dimensional raw data. Okay. As a byproduct of variational autoencoders, researchers figure out that, hey, this decoder is actually interesting, right? We can sample a random Gaussian vector and feed it to the decoder as input. And then we're going to be able to generate a new sample, maybe a new image, right? So this idea of generating data from noise came from there. Okay. So later we had this very successful model of generative adversarial networks, which is about training a generator and a critic and letting them fight against each other in a self-playing manner. But the goal of GANs, again, is not for generation. The objective of training GANs is to figure out a better discriminator, a better classifier. But again, as a byproduct, this generator turns out to be a nice model that can generate new data that is interesting and making sense, but it's different from all the training data we have seen. Okay. So the idea of generative AI in this context is about we want to start with big data set, maybe images, maybe audio data, maybe text data, maybe protein structures, okay? And then we want to learn a generative model that can transform noise into novel data samples. Okay, we want to create new images, new videos, new protein structures. So that's what we think about generative AI models. Okay, so what is diffusion model? So diffusion model is about starting from white noises and decode into an image. So this is the very first success of diffusion models, decoding images out of white noise. Okay. And diffusion models apply to actually a broad set of problem domains. We know that diffusion model, actually diffusion transformer, is the backbone of Sora, the state-of-the-art video generation model by OpenAI. Okay, so this video of a pirate ship in a coffee cup, this video is generated or decoded starting from white noise. Okay. Diffusion models can also be used to design new protein structures and new protein amino acid sequence. So this is an animation from Davis Baker group from the RF diffusion project. They can generate new protein structures and new binders to specific target. Okay, so what is diffusion model and how does it work? So diffusion model basically applies a sequence of transformations starting from white noise. And in the context of image, we can think about it as a denoising process. So a new image or a new data point is going to emerge and become more and more clear throughout the sequence of transformations. So this is what diffusion models do. We also call this process, we call it just denoising process or backward generation process. Okay. And how do we apply the sequential transformation? We're going to apply it through this neural network. So in Stable Diffusion and DAI, the neural network we use is going to be this UNet, which is designed specifically for images. Okay. For Sora, it's a different transformer architecture. Okay. But we want to know that every single step of this transformation is done by using a complex, large neural network. Okay. And we're going to apply these transformations for a large number of time steps. Okay. In practice, like say that we apply a transformation, for example, for 1,000 time steps. Okay, a very large number. Okay, so this is what we want to achieve using diffusion models. Okay, so in the first part of this talk, I will discuss the very basics of diffusion models, as well as the foundation statistical theory of diffusion models. What is being learned and why we trust them. Okay, and in the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how can we adapt diffusion process to generate something of specific interest. Okay, so let's start with the foundations. Okay, so again, we want to generate data from noise through a sequence of transformations. Okay, and generating data from noise, you can imagine this is a highly non-trivial process. Okay, so actually, when we talk about diffusion process, we are going to involve both a forward process and a reversal backward process. Okay. Okay. So this is a picture from Baker's RF diffusion paper. We can generate protein structures in a way very similar to generating images. So here, the goal is that we're going to start with a point cloud in 3D dimensions. And the point clouds are going to be just IID Gaussians. Okay? The goal is to apply a sequence of transformations, and eventually we get a nice, reasonable protein structure. So this is the generation process. Okay? That is what we want to learn. Okay? However, this generative process is challenging. It's complex. Okay? But we have a very simple process, which is the noising process. So if we start with data, we start from a protein structure, and we're going to just add Gaussian noise to corrupt my data. Then eventually, I'm going to get white noise. So I'm going to call this noising, this process of adding noise, as forward process. So diffusion models is about trying to learn the transition dynamics of the backward generation process from the forward noising process. Okay. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the mathematics. Okay. So what is a forward process? Forward process means that we start from a random data point, an image or a protein structure, and we're going to just add noise until it becomes just white Gaussian noise. So this is a very simple process. Okay. And mathematically, to make sure that the process doesn't diverge and to make sure that we can figure out a time reversal, I'm going to have -1/2 here. So we have a very simple OU process. Okay, and WT corresponds to the Brownian motion, just Gaussian noise. Okay, so actually, we can have pretty much an arbitrary function of xt here. We can have an arbitrary forward process as long as we have some contractive properties. But for simplicity, let's just put in -1/2. So this process will almost surely converge to a Gaussian distribution or a Gaussian process in the limit. Okay, so that's the forward process, super simple. We can simulate this process easily by sampling an image and add noise to it. Okay, so the goal is to learn the time reversal of this trivial forward process. Okay, because if we can reverse the forward process, it will mean that we can start from noise and decode and get data as the limit. Okay, so the underlying mathematics is deeply rooted in stochastic diffusion process in applied probability. Okay, it turns out that for this stochastic differential equation corresponding to an OU process, okay, for this particular very simple forward SDE, we can write down mathematically what is the dynamics of the corresponding time reversal, the backward process. Okay, so the time reversal is going to be, again, another stochastic differential equation. And I have this particular transition function here. So this is the log likelihood of x. Okay, taking gradient with respect to x. So this is the so-called the score function. Okay, so if we know the score function, then this backward process is going to be exactly the time reversal of the forward process of adding noise. Okay, and this is what we want to learn. Okay. So basically, the idea of training a diffusion model is as follows. We're going to simulate the forward process by adding noise. And then we want to train a backward process. For example, using that particular UNet as an approximation to this particular score function, which we do not know. Okay? So if we have a good approximation to this function, it will mean that now I can start from noise, apply the SDE. And the first time step in the denoise process, if we look at this particular random variable, the distribution, the marginal distribution of this random variable should match the marginal distribution of the second to last time step in the forward process. Okay, and we continue. So my second step, this marginal distribution of this random variable should match the third to last time point in the forward process. So we want to reverse the process in a way that we match all the marginal distribution. And eventually, we want to have the end point, the limiting distribution of this backward process. We want this distribution to match the distribution of the initial distribution of my forward process. Okay? So that's what we want. And it's all about training a neural network to approximate this score function. So just a little bit about training. So the basic idea is we're just going to minimize the square loss. So S is going to be my score network, maybe a UNet. Okay. I want to match S, my score network, with the true score function, which we do not have. So there are some technicality here. So we cannot take integration from 0 to capital T. We have to start from a small initial positive T0 for some technical reasons. And further, we can play a trick with this forward and backward process. And my regression loss can be equivalently derived into a conditional expectation for matching the score function over this conditional score. And this is something that can be easily calculated by taking Monte Carlo sampling from the forward process. So basically, this is something we can sample from the forward process. And we can match score to this guy. And then we can train a neural network to figure out the best parameter of this score network. So that's the basic idea. OK. So the next question is, we want to understand what is going on. And we want to understand, is diffusion models going to learn what we want to learn? So if we apply diffusion models to generate images, usually we are more flexible in terms with respect to the quality of images, right? Because we have our eyes, we can tell if an image is good or not good. But if we want to use diffusion models to generate protein structures, protein designs, or biological variants, right? We cannot tell using our bare eye if the generated samples are good or not. So we need to understand the theoretical foundation of diffusion models before we can use it for generating designs that we cannot easily verify. Okay. So the first theoretical question we try to answer is, can diffusion models learn the underlying data distribution? What can be learned exactly? The second question is, suppose that my diffusion models can indeed learn the data distribution. Then can we fine-tune or adapt the diffusion model to generate something we really want, to customize the generation process? And can we do it efficiently? So we're going to try to answer those two questions with basic theoretical results today. Okay, so let's start with question number 1. Okay. So one observation is when we think about modeling the data distribution. So data, practical data, are usually structured and low-dimensional. Okay. For example, if we take pictures of a teapot from different angles, okay, we can go around the teapot and take pictures, right? So each image is going to be represented by a bunch of pixels. We have a long vector if we flatten it, okay? But however, this set of teapots really has only effective dimension 1 because we have only 1 degree of freedom to describe the image. So in other words, this ring of teapot images can be viewed as basically a one-dimensional curve in the space of all images. The intrinsic dimension is 1. Okay. So researchers try to analyze what is the intrinsic dimension of image data sets, starting from MNIST, the smallest one, to ImageNet, the most comprehensive image library. Okay. And it turns out that by using some kernelized nearest neighbor estimation approach, it turns out that the effective dimension of ImageNet is only 43, meaning that we can map this ImageNet data into a Euclidean space of dimension 43, and they're enough to capture most of the variations in the ImageNet data set. Okay, so this is good. So our question, we can change our question and make it sharper. So we want to ask, can diffusion models learn the data structure? Not only the distribution of data, we also want to learn the structure if the data are structured. Okay. So however, this is a quite challenging problem. Okay. For example, say that we start from our data. My data could lie on this nice manifold. Okay. But as we add noise to data, my noisy stochastic process in the forward process, they are going to deviate away from the nice data manifold. We are going to lose this structure as we add noise. And now you can imagine that if we want to reverse the process, we have to start from a bunch of random noise, and then we have to concentrate onto the real manifold, right? So this is much more challenging than simply using a neural network to approximate a particular function. Okay. So we're going to make some assumptions. So the simplest mathematical assumption we can think about is, what if we assume that my data simply can be embedded into a linear space? So here, phi is going to be an embedding map or a feature map. And Z is going to be a latent embedding in a lower dimensional space. And matrix A is going to tell me what is the representation of the latent subspace. Okay, so let's assume that our data takes this form. And the raw dimension, the ambient dimension of my data, in the case of images, can be simply the number of pixels times 3, because we have RGB, right? But in the intrinsic dimension, which is the true dimension of my data manifold, maybe only 43. So to understand the theory of diffusion models, we also need to work with the score neural network. Okay, so we're going to simplify the UNet. So if you're familiar with computer vision, you know that UNet involves this multi-level hierarchical structure with just different, I would say like convolution layers with different levels of granularity. And we have a residual link on each level. Okay, I'm going to simplify it to one single level. Okay, one residual link. Okay, and also I'm going to simplify my conv layers into a simple linear decoder and a simple linear encoder and a simple linear decoder. And then here we can have just a feed-forward, fully connected neural network to capture nonlinearity. Okay, so this is a mathematical abstraction of UNet. Okay, and we're going to analyze this particular score network. Okay, so one key insight, if we try to work with diffusion models and analyze its statistical property, is that the score function, which we're trying to approximate, actually has a nice decomposition into the on-subspace drift and the orthogonal component, which has nothing to do with the dynamics we want on the real subspace. Okay. So what happens is, if we try to analyze the decoding, the backward generation process, okay, I'm going to go through this very quickly. We can try to analyze this overall stochastic process by projecting it down to the latent subspace and analyzing the orthogonal component and the on-subspace dynamics in a decoupled way. So this decoupling isn't free. Okay, so this decoupling is a product of the particular way we construct score network and the particular way we construct the forward process. Okay. But the short story is one can try to analyze the SDE in the projected subspace and in the orthogonal component, and turns out that the two decoupled processes have different dynamics. Okay, we can show that the score function learned by training on finite number of data points in a way can try to contract off support error. And the process is going to be increasingly concentrated around the true subspace. Okay? And within the true subspace, then we have a nicer dynamics, and we can show convergence to modeling the latent distribution in the lower dimensional subspace. Okay, so this idea also can be generalized to just manifold data, because in the real world, we cannot assume our data is being linear. We can have just general manifold. But the basic idea is still the same. We can try to analyze how the score function is going to push my generative backward process, both on the manifold and also how the off manifold error is going to contract through the SDE. Okay, and basically the two processes after decomposition, they have very different dynamics. One error converges much faster than the other one. Okay. Okay, so to make the mathematical work for manifold data, we have to do a bunch of additional work to deal with like curvature and the crossover terms, blah, blah, blah. But you can imagine the overall concept is really the same. Okay, so what we can prove is as follows. So we were able to show that first, diffusion model with the correct score network architecture is indeed an efficient density estimator. So meaning that when we think about using diffusion models to generate new sample, there is an underlying distribution that is being learned in the diffusion model. And that underlying distribution is a nice density estimator. And we were able to prove some non-parametric statistical rate. And what's notable is that, so this rate depends on little d, the intrinsic dimension of my data manifold, rather than the bigger d, the ambient dimension. Okay, so this rate basically says that diffusion models are able to learn the data, the structure, are able to learn the intrinsic structures of data. Okay, it can learn the data manifold. Okay, and further, because diffusion models can learn the data manifold, we also show that newly generated samples are high fidelity. By fidelity, we mean that if I generate a new protein, it is better to be a real protein. It has to make sense. And by making sense, it means that it should belong to the protein manifold in our universe. Okay, so we want our new generated samples to belong to the data manifold. And that's what we mean by fidelity. Okay, so basically, this was basically the first statistical rate for analyzing diffusion models and for showing that it can adapt to data's latent structures. And that's all we need to understand diffusion models for approximating unconditioned distributions. Okay. So next, let's move on to question 2. So we know that diffusion models can learn distributions. Okay. So now we want to put our diffusion models into practical use. I want to generate something specifically to our needs. Okay, so can we control the generation of diffusion models towards specific objective functions or to have a particular attribute? And can we do it efficiently? Okay. So again, so diffusion models can be made to generating samples with desired attributes. Again, this is the example of RF diffusion. So it can generate a binder design from a user-specified target. Okay. So this is different from modeling the overall distribution of all proteins. Okay. This is about generating a binder that binds to a particular target, and we want to make this process to be able to be customizable. Okay. And what's behind this? Okay. So the idea behind such targeted generation is very simple. Okay. So let's look at the simple image case, right? If we play with ChatGPT-4, we can say, hey, generate a dog, right? And then we'll get a dog. So here we have a prompt, and our prompt is going to be a class label of my image. Okay? And this class label is going to be called a guidance. It's going to change and tweak the backward generation process and steer it towards this particular label that we want. Okay. And to put it mathematically, okay, imagine that we have trained a diffusion model to capture the joint distribution between x and y, x being the image and y being the class label. Y can be just a discrete label. Okay. And then instead of using the score function, we can use the conditional score. So here we're conditioning on this guidance label. And this y here will change the transition function and this guide it towards generating a dog. Okay, and there are like several ways to implement this idea. Okay. Okay, so we basically want to take this classifier-based diffusion to solve more complex tasks. And the task we have in mind is to optimize. We want to be able to optimize any structured data. Okay, so now let's rethinking optimization through the lens of generative AI models. Okay, so in my PhD, I did a lot of work on traditional optimization, stochastic gradient descent, stochastic approximation, and how to think about having, I would say, a gradient flow over a complex landscape. Okay, so when we think about optimization, we're usually thinking about something like this. We have some landscape of my objective function f. We may know f, and sometimes we may not know f. Then we have to learn it either offline or in a Bayesian online way. Okay, and to optimize it, we have to start somewhere and then do gradient ascent or gradient descent, or there are tons of like gradient-based optimization algorithms. Right? This is how we think about optimization in a classical way. Okay, but if we now think about diffusion models or just generative AI models, what is optimization? We can think about that. I want to generate a solution x. Condition on that, the objective function of x is optimal. Okay? So in this way, we can transform an optimization problem into a generative problem, a generative AI problem, where the goal is to sample from a conditional distribution. Okay, so that's what we want to do. And in traditional optimization, optimization doesn't easily generalize to high-dimensional problems. And landscape F can be non-convex, especially if data is structured, especially if X has specific structures that cannot be easily captured. Okay, but however, with this notion of generative AI and generative optimization, we are actually able to solve much harder problems and much more complex problems that traditional optimization cannot solve. Okay, so why is that? So let's set up the theoretical analysis a little bit. Okay, let's think about when we use diffusion models or generative AI models to do optimization, what is the typical problem we're thinking of? Okay, so the problem is that we're going to have some training data, maybe just protein structures, okay, and maybe images, and I want to generate a new protein structure, or I want to generate a new CAD design from previous designs, okay. Okay, and usually in my training data, we usually have many more unlabeled data points than labeled data points, okay. So we're going to assume that we have a big data set of unlabeled X, and we have a much smaller data set of labeled X. So in the labeled data set, each X comes with a measurement Y, which is going to be a noisy measurement of the objective value of X, f of X, okay? And we do not assume knowledge of F. We have to learn it, okay? So for example, if we think about protein AI, okay, usually we can try to collect thousands of data sets of different proteins, but most of them do not come with the annotations or measurements you care about, right? Maybe you only have 100 measurements of a particular biochemical property, maybe affinity or stability of the particular antibiotic you want to develop, okay? And also, we can think about this in terms of RNA-seq analysis. Most of the data sets do not come with the label you care about, right? You only have labeled data, maybe like you only have like 1% of all data that are labeled with what you want to predict. Okay, so we're going to work with this. Okay, and this particular problem, if we think about it as an optimization problem, this is actually known as off-policy bandit optimization, okay, which is about, I want to optimize some reward function which we do not know, but we have some measurements, right? Then what can we learn from the measurements to find the best estimator of the optimal solution? Okay. Okay, so here we propose a meta-algorithm to study diffusion optimizer. Okay, so this actually contains classifier diffusion as a special case, but classifier diffusion only work with discrete labels and discrete guidance. Here we want to apply diffusion to solve general optimization with general objective function f. Okay, so the first step is if we have label data, we can do reward learning, right? You can pick your favorite algorithm. It can be regression, or it can be Thompson sampling, or some Bayesian Gaussian process. Okay, and second step is we're going to try to label my bigger unlabeled data set with my learned reward function. So we get a bunch of pseudo labels. Okay, so those pseudo labels are going to act as additional guidance to my pre-trained, on top of my pre-trained diffusion process from unlabeled data. Okay, and mathematically what's happening is that if we have pseudo rewards, right, then we can essentially add this reward as guidance. And this will only affect the denoising generation process. We actually do not need to change the pre-trained model. Okay? And lastly, if we want to generate a sample, then it's very simple. It's very easy. We can just say that, hey, I want to have a sample with target reward equaling A. And then you can make A 100 or 1,000. Okay, this is super simple. We'll just get what we want by prompting the model with the guidance signal. Okay, so this is conceptually very simple, okay? And does this work? Okay. So because fundamentally we're trying to pre-train on unlabeled data and then add reward learning as additional guidance, okay? So the theoretical question is, we want to know if we're still generating good quality data. Okay. And we want to improve the objective values, right? But however, if we try to use generative model to do optimization, to do de novo design, we are basically shifting the distribution from a training distribution to a target distribution corresponding to the conditional guidance, okay? And this can be problematic if my data has structures. So if my data belongs to a nice linear subspace, okay, but my diffusion models can only approximate the latent structure. So by shifting from the distribution of training data to a target distribution, we may also jeopardize the learned structural information. Okay, so we have to be careful with distribution shift here. Okay, so we try to provide some theoretical bounds. So we were able to show that it is indeed possible to guarantee that all generative samples have high fidelity. So one can prove some off-support bounds. And further, one can show some suboptimality bounds. So the first part is mostly coming from learning reward from offline data on top of the learned subspace representation. And the second one comes from pre-training. And I'm going to consider the pre-training error to be negligible because we have a huge amount of pre-training data set. So we don't have to read the mathematical formula closely. But I want to say that this particular error bound matches the minimax optimal bounds for off-policy bandit optimization, assuming that the latent subspace is known. Okay, which means that diffusion models is implicitly a representation learner. And when we use diffusion for optimization, it's going to extrapolate in the data manifold. So the optimization gap and optimization efficiency is much, much better because we're optimizing while preserving the data's latent structures. Okay. So one can make mathematics more tedious by adding just general nonlinear, non-parametric functions. You don't have to read the formula. Okay, so basically, in short, one can show that diffusion models for general manifold data can be utilized for general optimization for linear and nonlinear objective functions. And what's happening is diffusion models, because we're doing pre-training, or oftentimes we do not pre-train by ourselves, we're using a pre-trained model, and that model already has captured the data's intrinsic structure. And then when we do optimization, we're extrapolating in the correct manifold. So new samples have high fidelity. Also, we can show that new samples are provably efficient as near optimal solutions. Okay. So this is our second paper on foundation of diffusion models, but not only for modeling distributions, also for optimizing and extrapolation. Okay. So we do have a tuning parameter, which is the guidance signal we're conditioning on. Okay. So one may ask, like, can I always get what we want? Can I just tune my target values to be arbitrarily high so we can have arbitrarily powerful new proteins, right? That's not going to happen. So we did some very simple, this is a synthetic simulation, right? So on the x-axis, we're tuning the guidance strength or our target value. Just think about that as a tuning parameter, okay? So we can actually measure the distribution shift learned by my diffusion models, okay? So you can see that the distribution shift is going to suddenly increase and explode if we overly extrapolate, meaning that at some point, the nice learned manifold structure will be lost because we're just going too far. We're going too far from the original data manifold and data support. And then if we look at the actual reward or the actual objective we're trying to maximize, okay, so we can tune the parameter and improve the reward, but then after we start to suffer from huge distribution shift, the quality will degrade, okay? And at the same time, the fidelity error is going to increase if we keep extrapolate. Okay, and this actually matches our theory. We cannot do better than off-policy bandit in the statistically optimal sense. Okay, so this is another numerical experiment we work with. So here we're generating images, but we have a specific reward function we want to maximize. And this reward function, basically, you can think about this like a reward function to measure the level of contrast and the level of colorfulness. Okay, and again, we can tune our guidance strengths to figure out different levels of optimization and improvement. So you can see that, so the images indeed improve in terms of our reward function. But if we extrapolate too much, you can see that the image actually become like jeopardized as we go out of support from the training data, and the quality would degrade. Okay. Okay. This is another example of diffusion models on optimal control. So this might not be an example you're familiar with, but let me explain that the problem of optimal control is I just want to keep that, that thing continue to hop. Okay. So it's a continuous control problem, and we're trying to like apply forces in the heap and in the joints. Okay, and there's a underlying like motion dynamics to that particular system. Okay. So control problems, if we think about control problems, usually we want to solve using reinforcement learning, solving Bellman equations, Q-learning, actor-critic, model-based RL, blah, 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 right? But we can actually cast control and robotics into a generative optimization problem. I want to generate a state trajectory of that robot. Condition on that, I want to have a high reward. My reward may be to just keep that thing hopping. Okay? So this is a nice generative AI problem. And it turns out that we apply our reward condition diffusion optimizer to this control problem. I say that, hey, I want to keep my robot hop for 320 seconds. That's my goal. That's the reward I want. Now, tell me what should be the trajectory. So the diffusion model is going to imagine what should be an ideal trajectory corresponding to that high reward. Okay? And it turns out that we compare the reward. Okay, so after generating the trajectory, we have a trajectory of states. Right? Then we can do inverse engineering to figure out the sequence of controls that will get me to that particular trajectory. That's how we learn the control policies. Okay, so that's it. So it turns out that we apply our reward diffusion optimizer to this control problem. Okay, so by tuning the target reward, we can get pretty good like performance of my robot. We also compared this algorithm with other RL benchmarks. It turns out that what we can get using diffusion optimizer is as good as, and sometimes even better than the best reinforcement learning algorithm. Okay, so this is a simple control problem, but the message is surprising. Okay, because we're not solving Bellman equation, we're not approximating value functions. We're simply thinking about this as modeling a joint distribution between reward and trajectory. And this can actually already work by extrapolating from the manifold of trajectories and generating something with better reward that has never been seen in the data set. Okay, so that's the control example. Okay, so basically I want to pitch to you that generative AI models, in particular diffusion models, is giving us a new modality to optimization. Okay, so with diffusion models, we can pre-train on a large amount of data to learn the structures. We can use guidance to optimize. And further, we're also working on how to make diffusion models more adaptive. For example, if we collect measurements in a sequence of wet lab experiments, then we can utilize our newly generated data to fine-tune our diffusion models or to adapt the learning process. And one could have probability regret and fast exploration in the intrinsic space. And so diffusion models and generative AI allows us to do high-dimensional structure optimization. It can find optimal solutions that has high fidelity, adaptive, and sample efficient. It applies to protein AI and robotic control. Okay, so just a few more minutes. Before we conclude, I want to mention that the way we guide diffusion models to do optimization and generation. So this is actually very similar to something which I guess you guys do all the time in biology. So evolution is actually also a diffusion process. The only difference is if we think about like evolution in sequence of genes or sequences of amino acids, by the evolution or the diffusion process is usually discrete. Okay? But in a way similar to how we add guidance to control a diffusion process, scientists are also adding guidance to control the directed evolution process for finding new antibiotics, finding new biological variants. right? And there was a very nice survey by Francis Arnold a few years ago about different type of machine learning models people have tried to add guidance to the selection and the screening step in a directed evolution pipeline. Okay, so we built on top of this. Okay, so we propose a Thompson sampling guided directed evolution process. In a way, similar to diffusion models for image generation, because we are thinking about, I would say, a state transition process, and we're doing something on top of it to accelerate its convergence towards something we want. Okay, so the evolution process involves random mutation and random recombination. Okay, and then we add a posterior sampling method that's going to keep track of a posterior of the reward function or the attribute we want to optimize. And we're going to use this as a feedback to the evolutionary process. And this turns out to be able to efficiently and provably explore a discrete sequence space. And we applied this idea in a way, we applied this idea of AI-guided direct evolution to design the guide RNA sequences of CRISPR-Cas12a systems. And this is a work, actually, I don't know if Jiaqi is in the audience. Okay, so Jiaqi helped with our machine learning design of CRISPR here. Okay, so we were able to use AI-guided direct evolution to come up with newer barcodes that are more than 30 folds efficient than the benchmark. Okay, so lastly, I want to mention that we recently have done some work on training a language models on raw mRNA sequences from multiple species. And we combined mask training and additional information to, additional supervised learning, for example, like to predict second-order structure, stability, mean-fold energy, to regularize the language model training process, so we can learn something meaningful from pure data. Okay, so in the end, we were able to have a language model that's achieving SOTA performance on mRNA to protein translation task, and we utilize this model to design a new mRNA vaccine, because the mRNA sequence is the key design variable that controls the protein expressionness and also the effectiveness of an mRNA vaccine. Okay, so I found this very cool because this is another form of generative AI models, and we can utilize it for optimization. Okay, so lastly, I want to take this opportunity to tell a little about what we are doing in Princeton. So there is a very big AI efforts going on in Princeton, and in particular, I'm involved in incubating a new initiative on AI accelerated innovation. So this is actually my joint work with Ryan Adams, who was also trained at MIT. So we want to build this initiative to integrate AI into engineering, into design. And we're particularly interested into like engineering for design, AI for design, for fusion control, and AI for bioengineering. And we're going to have a university-wide AI research postdoc fellow programs. And I want to take this opportunity to advertise that. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mengdi, for a really wonderful talk. Okay, questions. So there are 2 microphones that you can just come down to, and I'll try to also walk around, and maybe Elizabeth can also take one of them. If you have one.
Hi, very inspirational slides. I have a question about the distribution shift, the slides. Like when you got the manifolds from the networks, so that's actually the distribution, right? You're kind of measuring directly the manifolds or the distribution. So from that point of view, would it be like more like an overfitting problem instead of distribution shift problem? Because in my domain, it's actually, I would say that's overfitting, because distribution shift means a different thing in my field. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I think distribution shift is a fairly general term.
Yeah.
Okay, and also I think there are 2, it's hard to go back. Maybe we can just look at this. Okay.
This one, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so in this particular case, by distribution shift, we are measuring the unmanifold distribution shift. Okay, so I think there are two parts of it. So data belongs to a manifold, or in other words, data admits a latent representation which we want to learn. But also, even if we have the perfect latent representation, data still has a distribution in the latent space, which is also something we want to learn. So the full picture is actually pretty like intertwined. So we have like distribution shift on the manifold, but things can get really bad if we go out of the N manifold, because things can go unboundedly worse as we go out of manifold. So if we look into the theoretical analysis, it's actually there could be compounding errors, as we can see. So it turns out, I think this particular key for this kind of application is we want to stay on manifold to make sure that we do not go crazily bad into something like that doesn't make sense.
How did you measure the closeness between the distributions or similarities between the distributions?
You mean in theory or in practice?
In your practice, sorry.
In this numerical example, I think we were trying to simply trying to compare two. Let's see. I think we're comparing like just moments of the distribution and the covariance of distribution in this numerical example.
Like a covariance, something.
That's the simplest thing to do. I would say go to heuristic. You want to try it first.
Thank you, Mengdi. Very wonderful talk. And I want to know a little bit more about how you guide the diffusion process. So are you just sampling from Gaussian and generate as many samples as possible and evaluate the score, or are you doing something like smarter?
Okay, we can go back here. So that's a great question. That's a wonderful question. Let's go back in from here. Okay, so if we trust our probability model, the way to guide diffusion models is simply to, I would say, replace the score with a conditional score. Okay, but however, this can be hard to implement, especially if my y can be a general objective function. Okay, so actually there are multiple ways to implement this or to approximate this. So in certain case, when we have a nice probability model, this guy can be easily computable, and this guy sometimes can be decomposed into the sum of the Poisson score and another function that can be easily computed in some cases. But more generally, we actually had we had some result I haven't got a chance to talk about today is we have some way to implement this more generally for general objective function by basically tweaking the SDE towards the gradient flow for steepest for improving function f. So I mean, this is something I didn't go through thoroughly. There are multiple ways to do this depending on the assumptions and especially if y is discrete or continuous or multi-value, then there are different ways to implement this. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Do you mind going back again to the slide you had up for the first question where you vary this A?
You mean the numerical example?
Yes. Like in this example, you show how you get sort of varying outcomes depending on which A you pick. But in practice, I only get to maybe pick one A, and it has to work, right?
And so in practice, A is a one-dimensional tuning parameter, so it has to be tuned. But it's very easy to tune because it's one-dimensional. Does it make sense?
But say I want to run this to do, I have this offline data, I run the method, and now I can do one biological experiment. So I can only pick one A. Is there anything that comes out of the theory or even just like rules of thumb from playing with
Great question. Great question. Actually, the reason we try to derive all the complicated like error bounds and equations is try to figure out a theoretical guidance for choice of A. But however, in practice, A is chosen as a tuning parameter. In practice for image generation and for video generation because it's one-dimensional. And one can use like a bisection search to easily find it at a cost of, only a log factor. Okay, but the point of doing theory is to choose that A. So in our paper, we actually provided theoretical guidance on how to choose A, given using like empirical quantities we can calculate from the data sets.
Okay, thanks.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the really nice talk. I have kind of a very high-level question about diffusion models, which is that, so in most of the examples you gave, you kind of were going from this really, really high entropy, high dimensional space, like the Gaussian noise, to this low entropy, low dimensional manifold. And you talked a little bit about, like, you know, the dimension of that sort of lower dimensional manifold. But what I'm wondering is the gap between the dimension of the Gaussian noise and the manifold. Like, is that important? Is that a feature? Like, does it need to?
Okay, that's a great question. You are like hinting towards how to accelerate diffusion models.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's true. Like diffusion models works by trying to learn a forward and backward process from a high entropy distribution and a low entropy distribution, right? And we cannot really reduce entropy. So the reversal is only in terms of marginal distributions. Okay.
Yeah.
So So the question is, okay, if the two distributions are similar to begin with, so then training diffusion model is just easy. Mm-hmm. Okay. And actually, this is also what people are trying to do to, for example, accelerate diffusion transformers for SORA. And also people are trying to utilize this idea to think about diffusion models over discrete space. So basically the amount of noise we're adding, okay, and also the initial distribution, they are part of the inductive bias because we're trying to model something from a Gaussian distribution, right? It's like our initial assumption is a Gaussian, right? Then if this assumption is correct, then we can have an easier and smooth transformations. If the initial assumption is bad, then we're going to need a bunch of data. Right? So this is actually what this kind of research on diffusion models is trying to tell us. We're trying to figure out if we can incorporate additional structure and additional inductive bias in a way by maybe tweaking the bias and tweaking the initial distribution, or think about how the model network can be used as a probability or distributional assumption. So there are a lot of very interesting connections between like statistical learning theory and diffusion models for density estimation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mengdi, for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.